Well, it's a little bit after 9 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to say good morning to everybody and welcome to Adult Studies. And I'm very pleased that this is the beginning of a 5-part series entitled Through Women's Eyes. And we are starting out with Mary Cunes, who is going to be talking about women of the Bible, which is a pretty broad topic. And so I'm anxious to hear what she has to say. Next week, we are going to be joined by Madeline Hart Anderson, who is the pastor at Westminster Presbyterian. And she is going to be speaking to us about Mary, Mother of God. Jeannie Bowman is going to talk to us about the women mystics after that. I'm going to be talking about feminist theology, which I always have to say I know nothing about, but am reading about. And following that, Diane Buchanan is going to be speaking about choice and women's reproductive rights and how the church has approached that. That will be the last one. So I'm very excited about the series. And before we get started, I just wanted to say I'm so happy to see all your little faces within those squares this morning. So anyway, Mary, it is all yours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I'm Mary Cunes, and I came in 2008, left in 2013, came back in 2017, and am very, very part-time at the church as parish associate in pastoral care. And glad to be with you this morning. And I have enough material here for the next 3 hours, so I assume y'all aren't going anywhere. This is some topic because it's hard to know exactly what to cover. But back in the day, I worked for the denomination and for social justice. I was associate for justice for women. So I come at this from that kind of angle, actually. And so particularly when we get to the New Testament and start talking about Paul, I'll have a whole lot more to say that's more specific. But I also want to leave plenty of time. So this is going to be a romp through the Bible. There's no other way to put it. And I want to start a little bit with background on women in the Old Testament. And obviously, again, my hunch is a lot of you know a lot of this stuff. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of detail, I hope. In the Old Testament, there are 1,426 names, okay? Over 1,400 names. Over 1,300 of those names are male, which shouldn't be a surprise. So there are only 111 women's names in the Old Testament. So it's not surprising that the biblical perspective is predominantly male. And you'll hear more about that when Mary Ann talks about feminist theology, I'm sure. The focus of the Old Testament is on the public and communal life of the people. Life was dominated by men as kings, warriors, priests, prophets, and sages. So a lot of the information about women comes from extra biblical resources, archaeological excavations, etc. The primary life for the Old Testament was farming, and the family household was the basic unit, of course. And it was multi-generational. So they farmed grains, grapes, figs, dates, nuts, seeds, legumes, vegetables. There may have been a small amount of animals, sheep, goats, cows, oxen, as a source of dairy. The field labor that was women's responsibility, again, women and children, would take 4 to 5 hours a day, in addition to childcare, food preparation of domestic animals. They made most of their items of clothing. And some of the women were actually village potters. Choosing to remain childless was not an option. So you tell me how many hours in the day there had to be to get all this work done and how much sleep they got. Senior women, again, this is multi-generational, senior women tended to be in the managerial positions. They taught other women and children the tasks that each house would know, and they assigned the jobs. So some women held expertise in public performance as well, sung hymns, knew dance. Men controlled most of the economic assets. Women were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, bakers, cooks, weavers, managers, teachers, worshipers, etc. So the prevailing monotheism of scripture in the Hebrew Bible, along with the non-sexual nature of the divine creativity. Remember, God, the non-Hebrew religions were far more involved with all the sexual stuff that you've heard about, but this was primarily non-sexual nature of the divine creativity. And there were occasional female metaphors for God. This may have contributed toward the relative social unity of male and female in household settings. Most of their lives took place in the city, and most of their lives took place in rural areas on the farms, and most places called city were just overgrown rural areas, overgrown towns. But if you lived in an overgrown town, it may have been a smaller unit, which means that there may not have been enough people for self-sufficient household unit to take care of everything. And this meant that some women were released from their unending toil. But there was still an emphasis on family integrity. So that's the background of what we see in a lot of the Hebrew scriptures anyway. Now, there are plenty of, in fact, I have a 3-volume set where one of them names all of those 111 women, plus all the unnamed women. So if you want to unmute and just pop out names of women in the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures that you know.
Rachel, Leah,
Esther,
Hannah,
Ruth,
Rebecca,
Deborah,
Miriam,
Shipra,
Sarah,
Yeah.
Hagar.
Toba,
Good. See, so you've done your homework over the years. You've been in good Bible studies over the years. How many know Jael or Yael?
Heard of her?
Yeah, Yael used to be one of my favorites. Well,
Deborah, in that case.
back in the day when yeah. Do you know the story of Yael?
no.
Because this is again typical of some of the women. They were, and I'll get to her in a minute. Actually, women tended to be prophets, judges, generals. They had all the ones we know about had absolute leadership positions. Esther was a queen, as you know, and saves her people from genocide. There are a lot of heroic maids. Maids saved some patriarchal children. As you'll remember, Hagar, mother of Abraham's first son, Ishmael, Bilhah and Zilpah were maids and bore sons to patriarchs, which then was okay. It was okay to be with other women if they weren't part of your direct blood family linear. That was deemed proper, even in the New Testament, as we get into those things. Judith saves her people by killing the enemy general along with her maid. She beheads him, and the maid stuffs his head in her apron. Just a little anecdote there, as you know. Miriam was right up there with Moses, and was really an equal, even though she challenges Moses and loses. It's not because she was a woman, because as well who did that. And then we have Tobit, who it was believed a demon killed her 7 husbands on the night of their marriage of Sarah, on each of their wedding nights. And the 8th husband comes along and exorcises the demon. Her father didn't know and sends Tobit, his maid, to find out whether the husband is alive or dead. And she reports back that he is alive and nothing wrong. And that they deem as the first healing story in the Hebrew Bible. So we have all kinds of that going on in the Bible. And let me, if I can get there fast, I'll share the story of Yael. Because it is a little bit, let me see here. Yeah. So Yael is sent out again to kill an enemy general. He asked for water and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank, he fell, he lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank. This is all part of the Song of Deborah. And so these women were warriors as well. Absolutely. So, so I want to jump to Jesus and Jesus and women. The Gospels and the epistles really use the word for human being when speaking of Jesus. So we know Jesus was a man, but he was more than a man. He was representative of male and female. And he most clearly transforms the customs and the traditions of his time, as we know. He talks to women, even despised ones. And I don't have the story right at my fingertips, but I love the woman who asked him, I believe, to come heal her. And he says he's too busy, get out of his face. And she keeps pushing at him. Remember that story? I love it because he's not necessarily the gracious, compassionate one all the time. And she keeps pushing on him until he responds and takes care of her requests. And so he learned, he was teachable, which to me says he was certainly human. He heals men and women. Women are with him everywhere. You know this. Women go with him to Golgotha. They are the last ones that he speaks to, before his crucifixion. They traveled with him. They had the rite of baptism. Women are joint heirs. The women from Galilee traveled with him to Jerusalem, and many feel that they were the bankers, that they were the ones who collected, I'm sure, food and money and all of that and took care of his ministry, that they made it all work. What's the big surprise there? That is still happening. The symbolic, yes, they weren't named as one of the 12. It's a symbolic significance of the 12. There were 12 tribes of Israel, and Judas' replacement had to be a Jew and a male, because that was Jewish at the time. But there were certainly Gentiles and women who I think were disciples right along with them, even though perhaps they weren't named. And the reason why some of this is astonishing is because a pious rabbi wouldn't even discuss religious matters with his wife. So all the stories that we have of women with Jesus he broke all those barriers. And I could cite plenty of scripture if you're interested in that at some point. Women in the New Testament really didn't write about themselves. They didn't have time to write about themselves. So again, we get a lot of the information about New Testament folks from other sources. The economic status shaped the ways in which they could participate in the Christian community and the ways in which they could live out their faith in everyday life. Early Christian women lived under the Roman Empire, as we know. Women were seen as physically and mentally inferior beings in the Greco-Roman world. Superstitious, supported the norm of male political power and authority. The Roman model, however, was neither universal nor inevitable. There was a woman ruler in the region, and it was possible to inherit a position from your husband and keep it. So there are always exceptions, and always have been, to the patriarchy. There was a line of rulers and queens in Ethiopia, so none of this was unheard of. Brown, Black, and white-skinned peoples intermingled and intermarried throughout all regions and the social strata of the empire. There was actually full participation in the Greco-Roman culture and economics and politics. But some of this required wealth. You had a better chance of being involved in politics if you had some wealth behind you. Jewish folks, the Hebrew people, were allowed to live according to their own laws and customs without government interference. As you're all thinking, oh, wait a minute, I know stories. There was certainly violence sometimes, local circumstances, where there would be riots break out over Rome and their taxes, their access to citizenship, and their right to live by Jewish law and customs. So this happened from time to time. Roman order was done through military and taxes and favors granted to local aristocracies. The Hebrew people, the early Christians, were expected to give Roman soldiers anything they wanted. Local revolts grew into full-scale war by the year 66. The Roman military then, with the destruction of religion in the political capital of Jerusalem, of course, altered the structure and all of that. The unit was still the household, so that's how women lived. And there were slave members of the household. Some slave members were between 1 and 500 and wealth. I want to get more, I'm going to be careful here about and get more into Paul and New Testament. Again, marriage, as you know, was often in the mid-teens or as early as 12. Many women were dead by the age of 40. So that again gives you a little bit of context. Let me see. Early on in the first century, there were a lot more freedoms for women. It's only as time grew on that there were more restrictions put in place. I have my own theory about that, but I think I'll keep it to myself. Are you all aware that with Paul, there are scriptures that have been used over the years to prevent women from being ministers and elders and speaking and teaching? Okay. That became very clear to me. There were I remember, I always repress the details, but I remember quite clearly. I was ordained in 75. So I was in the first 300 that were ordained. And I remember very clearly, I was on the Council of Women in the Church, going to a seminar in Pittsburgh, sitting in a room as a participant with 3 male leaders. One of them I know, and I can't remember his name, was a well-known member of the Pittsburgh Seminary faculty, speaking about why women had no right to be ordained, that it was against Christ and against the church. And that was a belief by many. When I was installed as associate pastor in Atlanta, there was one family who believed that and believed I should not be in the pulpit preaching. And so when I was preaching, my colleague would call them and let them know. And this was fine with me. I don't want anyone to be out there kibitzing or whatever. And so he would let them know, and they wouldn't come to church that Sunday. Otherwise, they were there. So they didn't leave the church because of me, but they certainly had their feelings, and I still was pastor to that family in several different ways. So you read in 1 Corinthians, women prayed and prophesied. But then in chapter 14, they're not permitted to speak. And so again, context is everything. And if you go back and look at the context of all of this, you see that we're dealing with Paul speaking to Gentiles, and Gentiles came out of different religious backgrounds, just like we have folks in the church of different religious backgrounds, different races. And so that's part of what you're dealing with. Women were not taught Hebrew. Many were not fluent in Greek. And so what the scholars believe is that Paul did not want interruptions in the service. Many coming out of the Greco-Roman culture who really converted to the early church were fairly emotional. Have any of you heard speaking in tongues in any church? Some of you have. Okay. If you've ever heard speaking in tongues, it's quite something. And apparently some of that was done in a variety of ways, and Paul didn't like that. So some of these prescriptions we see placed on women that we read about in the different scriptures in the New Testament are trying to bring order to the services. Women apparently some women did not understand what was going on in the service, and they would sit there and talk with each other. And so part of that saying, be quiet, was his wanting women to pay attention. He wanted to teach them and he wanted them to learn, which again was not done. Women were not taught. And he was wanting to make sure they could learn and understand and take part. The big one, of course, we get is from Timothy and Titus, where they are to keep silent, not to speak, not to, and we're dealing with the Gnostics at this point. Timothy and Titus were probably not written by Paul, by the way. And the Gnostics took over. And I don't understand the Gnostics really well, but they believed that Eve was a big deal, that Eve and the serpent, even the serpent, were revered pretty much. And so Paul was trying to keep order and keep the Gnostics at bay out of that first century. And for instance, in the first century, a husband could divorce his wife for any cause. If she burned the food, she was out of there. Something as simple as that. He could do that. But Jesus' attitude had a lot to do with changing that. And then by the second century, that was also out of there. Paul brought more order to family life, really. But First Timothy was a part of all of that, and maybe because women were very active in the church. So when the church wanted to draw lines between orthodoxy and the heretical that some women came in from, the women led to idolatry, and that was all brought back later on. When someone to throw under the bus, women got thrown under the bus, is the way I guess I look at it in a lot of ways. But you have, again, plenty of women, and Paul had apostles that were teaching. He was sending out. We have Philip's 4 daughters, Priscilla. And again, it goes back as time went on. As time went on, things got more strict. And we get to popes who started changing things. But when we look at history, I want to name some women you may not have heard of. The 4th century, Marcella was the foremost biblical interpreter. Yael was the founder of the first Christian hospital in Europe. Paula was a major linguistic contributor in the translation of the Vulgate. Paul was a theological force in overcoming heresies. Proba put Virgil's poetry into a gospel story for Christian young people. So you have all kinds of, and all names of women. We also remember Galatians 3:28, which helped with all of this, that there is neither male nor female, but all are one before God. So was Paul inconsistent? Probably, but he was inconsistent over context, is what I have come to believe. Back in the day, I didn't like Paul at all. And I still have some problems with Paul, but I have learned that a lot of this is contextual. And when you don't take context into being, you prohibit women from preaching and teaching. And you go back to strictly these verses that you can find in Timothy and Titus and even in Corinthians. Of course, my question has always been, if you're going to follow those scriptures so tightly, there are plenty of others that they don't follow. So they pick and choose, which is what always, to me, was the downfall of this. Also, just to say, to give you a context again from Paul's realm, women coming in from the Gentile world, a lot of apostles then working with Paul didn't want to deal with Gentiles. They refused to Gentiles. Paul apparently was one of the few who agreed to teach Gentiles and bring them into the church, which caused a lot of consternation on the part of Jewish church members. Apparently, worship in the Greco-Roman world was very noisy, which again is part of this, please be silent. And they were very in their ecstasy, ecstatic. One of the things, I don't know if I can read it now, but it just kind of blew my mind. And it's gross, but it tells you again the world in which Paul was preaching. In the Gentile world, in their worship, the men would become so ecstatic, overcome, that they would castrate themselves, and women would pull apart live animals and eat the meat. This is what Paul was dealing with. So he set up all kinds of rules. If you were going to come into the Christian church in that 1st and 2nd century, you were going to have to behave. I never learned that when I was told about these scriptures and why I couldn't preach and why I couldn't teach. I don't remember anyone telling me about context. But this means everything, I think. So we have all there are other scriptures too, which have a lot of meaning. There's scriptures about submission, which when you look into the context is more about mutuality than females submitting to males. So there's all kinds of this. You can Google and get a lot more information, or a lot of books out there these days. But I want to give us a few minutes anyway for comments and questions about all of this. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I found it fascinating too to go back and research some of this. So that you have. Anyone? I put you all to sleep.
Mary,
Yeah,
it's
Bill.
Bill Humphreys. Nice job. I think you did with all that. A few years ago, I don't know the latest, it was suggested that the New Testament book of Hebrews might well have been written by a woman. Do you know about that idea?
I have heard that, but I haven't really researched it.
Yeah, that's where I am with it too.
And there are, I believe, books in the Apocrypha that are believed to have been written by women. The Apocrypha isn't an official part of the Protestant Bible, but certainly sheds light on that time.
Yeah, the book of Judith is part of the Apocrypha, I know, and which you were citing, and the book of Tobit too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The
Yes.
as far as women authors, Harold Bloom would have it that the J text of the Old Testament might have been written by a woman. So, one of the 4 primary sources for
Yes.
Old Testament texts, and matter of fact, he and a Hebrew translator have put together a called the Book of J, which is a translation of the J texts compiled, basically, which is interesting to read.
We would certainly like to believe that women got their voice involved here in some way. The issue, of course, is finding for any of this, but there are texts.
Yeah. Bloom thinks that she might have been
Yeah. So
part
we're
of the Court of Solomon.
and the wisdom. If you read the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, the Book of Solomon, it's wonderful in terms of equating. Well, I say equating women wisdom with God. That they're one and the same, so that they're, again, we come back to Galatians, neither male nor female.
Mary, could you speak just a little bit about down through history, why you think women got pushed to the back with regard to the church? I mean, we see that women were important in the early ministry. We see those names. We hear Paul or read about Paul speaking of them kindly, and they were the money, as you mentioned, behind much of the ministry early on. What happened?
Well, I don't know a lot of that history well, but patriarchy happened. The formation of the Catholic Church particularly became very male, and women got equated. Eve became evil. Eve is the one who tricked Adam, and so Eve then became evil in the sight of some people in the church. And Eve became equated with women. And so women were part of this. And in order to perpetuate male dominance, and females became relegated, I think. But it's patriarchy. We see it today. Patriarchy lives. To me, it's white supremacy is also about white male supremacy. I mean, that's it briefly. I'm looking at the time here. That's it briefly. Patriarchy got started. Males, I think, long ago began to feel inferior for whatever reasons, and did what they did to take back power. And of course, in some ways, they were the warriors, even though we have lots of examples of women doing way too much violence, to my way of thinking. Men were the ones that were permitted more into politics, had more power in the family home, and it was just perpetuated. That's its culture, its context.
We'll be looking forward to Mary Ann unpacking the masculinity of God in a few weeks.
Yes, indeed.
Don't get your hopes up too high. This is going to be a community discussion.
Yeah, you know, it's
Oh, go ahead, Mary. Sorry.
no, I was just going to say it's really fascinating when you get into the biblical histories and the women who were included. I mean, all these women who were included in the Hebrew Bible who did violence, and who did things by hook or by crook. It's fascinating how they made it in. Just as in the New Testament, all the stories about Jesus and women who made it into the canon, whom one would not expect. So there were cracks in the patriarchy way back when, that women were given credit over and over again where one wouldn't expect it. So the canon is fascinating to me. Mary Ann, you had a question. One last question.
Oh, I was just going to ask if there, before we finish up here, if there are any comments or questions from anybody before we disband. David?
Yeah, Mary, maybe you could explain to me. I am very intimately acquainted with congregations that still don't ordain women. And what's amazing to me that it's the women in those churches that are the stronger supporters of it. I keep asking when I go to churches of my relatives, why it is. And they just say that that's the way they interpret scripture. That's the way it is. And in a lot of cases, it's my relatives that the men would be more open to it, but it's the women that do it. And just one other comment, if you look at the membership rolls, if you go back into the history of our church, so it's not that far back, 1994, we had almost 1,200 members of the church. By 1995, it had dropped several hundred because we did have people that left First Presbyterian Church when Sheila came, because they felt the same way. We're not gonna have a woman pastor.
Yeah. Thanks, David. I meant to mention this. We have a church here in Santa Fe. Christ Church Presbyterian is Presbyterian Church of America, who do not believe in ordaining women. That's the premise on which that denomination was formed on Cordova, on Cordova Street. So we've got them right here. And I think there are, again, a variety of reasons why women let this happen. Some women believe this, but I think it's also easier. It's an easier life for women not to be in those positions. That's my cynicism about that. Let men do all the in front work, and they'll do behind the scenes, because a lot of us, number one, are trained to be behind the scenes, and a lot of us prefer to be behind the scenes. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. My concern is that they believe that they shouldn't speak or they shouldn't preach. That's my concern. You can choose not to do so, but not to be able to choose, I think, is unfortunate. I want to just end really briefly with a reading from one of this. It's pretty short, but it sort of sums this up. Women who, excuse my dog, women who were touched, healed, and forgiven by Jesus, women disciples who accompanied Jesus, remained with them when he died, witnessed his resurrection, and received his Holy Spirit, family members of apostles and disciples. All of these women formed the first female nucleus of the New Testament church, which quickly spread beyond Judea, Galilee, and Samaria into Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome. Some of these women we know by name, most remain anonymous. They were the poor, the wealthy, the widows, women of nobility and of low social status, even slaves, married and unmarried, wives of believers and wives of unbelievers. Among them were house church leaders, missionaries, and co-workers with Paul in a ministry of evangelization and teaching. Among them were apostolic eyewitnesses, empowered by their visionary, ecstatic experiences to expand the Jesus movement, whose Sophia God made possible their participation in a discipleship of equals. I thought that was a good conclusion. Thanks all for your attention for this romp through the Bible. Thank you all.